Smiljana Crnec. For 19 years, a family in a small village in northern Croatia told anyone who asked that their youngest daughter had moved to France and simply stopped keeping in touch. The neighbors believed it. When police finally opened a missing persons file in 2005, the family gave officers the same answer, and the file went nowhere. She had never left the house. She had been inside a chest freezer in that same home the entire time, in a room people walked past every single day. Jasmina Dominic was 23 years old and studying in Zagreb when she was last seen alive in the summer of 2000. She had grown up in Palovec, a farming village in the Međimurje region, close to the Hungarian border, in the house she shared with her parents and her older sister. Neighbors described her as someone who kept a low profile and gave nobody any trouble. She was not the kind of young woman anyone expected to cut off her entire family without a word. And yet, that is exactly what her relatives said she had done. The older sister was Smiljana Crnec. Born around 1974, she had never really left home either, still living in the Dominic family house with her husband and their 3 children. Neighbors who knew the family were not especially fond of her and remembered her as someone who had struggled at school. She had no criminal record of any kind. On paper, she was an unremarkable woman, raising a family in a village of a few hundred people. The court would later find that in the summer of 2000, Crnec struck her younger sister at least 5 times in the head with a blunt object. What she did afterwards is the part that separates this case from almost every other domestic killing on record. She put Jasmina's body inside a chest freezer in the family home and left it there. Not for a night, not for a season, but for 19 years. While she raised 3 children under the same roof and told everyone who asked that her sister was somewhere in France. The missing persons report filed in 2005 went nowhere for the simplest possible reason. The people closest to Jasmina, the ones investigators would normally lean on for information, were the ones giving them the story about France. There was no crime scene, no witness, and no urgency, and the case slid into the enormous pile of European missing persons files that nobody expects to close. It closed on February 16th, 2019, and not because of police work. A member of the family, reported to be Crnec's son-in-law, opened the freezer in the house and called the police the same day. Officers arrived in Palovec and brought in a neighbor to act as an official search witness, which is standard procedure in Croatia. That neighbor later described seeing the body of a woman crouched inside the freezer compartment, preserved by 19 years of cold. Smiljana Crnec was detained within hours. On February 20th, 2019, a court in Varaždin ordered her held for 1 month, citing the risk that she would flee the country and the risk that she would interfere with witnesses. How does a body stay inside a family home for 19 years without a single person living in that house ever saying a word? The trial ran at Varaždin County Court. Her defense argued the evidence was simply not strong enough, pointing to how much time had passed and how little could be reconstructed about a killing that happened before the youngest investigators on the case had finished school. The court was not persuaded. On June 30th, 2020, Smiljana Crnec was convicted of murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. That was the maximum available under the criminal code in force at the time the killing took place, and the Croatian state broadcaster reported that she cried as the verdict was read out. She appealed immediately. In 2021, the Supreme Court of Croatia upheld the conviction, which made it final. She took the case further still, to the Constitutional Court, which rejected her complaint in January 2024. Every level of the Croatian judiciary that examined the case arrived at the same conclusion. As of 2026, Smiljana Crnec is serving her sentence at Požega Prison, the main women's facility in Croatia. Her time inside has been interrupted more than once on medical grounds. A 3-month interruption was granted from September 2023 for treatment and surgery, and a further interruption was ordered around August 2024, during which she was seen walking through the streets of Varaždin. She remains incarcerated. Jasmina Dominic was 23 when she died, and the world outside that house did not learn what had happened to her until she would have been 42. That freezer sat in a house full of people who had every reason to open it and never did. 1,500 kilometers to the west, in a 1-bedroom flat in East London, another chest freezer was bought brand new, in cash, for one specific purpose. And the man who bought it made sure there was nobody around to ask him about it. Zahid Yunus. In April 2019, 2 police officers went to a flat in Canning Town in East London to carry out a welfare check on a man they had not been able to reach. He was not home. What one officer did notice, in the corner of the 1-bedroom flat, was a chest freezer that had been padlocked shut, with flies moving around the seal. They forced the lid open with a crowbar and found a woman inside. It would take several more days, the removal of the freezer and an X-ray machine before anyone realized there was a second woman underneath her. Henriette Sux was 34, a Hungarian mother of 3 who came to Britain in 2014 looking for work, was trafficked, and within 2 years had lost her passport, her housing, and any real safety net. Mirikan Mustafa, known to everyone as John, was 38, also a mother of 3, and her family last heard from her in May 2018. Prosecutors would later describe both women as vulnerable people living chaotic lives that included stretches of homelessness and addiction. Both were already known to the authorities as women at risk, which is the detail that makes the silence around their disappearances so hard to sit with. Zahid Yunus was 36 by the time he was convicted, and people around Canning Town knew him as Boxer. He was not an unknown quantity to police. At 17, he had been controlling and violent towards a girlfriend. In 2004, he was jailed for 2.5 years for unlawful sexual activity with a child and placed on the sex offenders register. He was later jailed for 4 years and 11 months for wounding and assaulting a 17-year-old girl. Detective Chief Inspector Simon Harding of the Metropolitan Police described him afterwards as a dangerous and repugnant man who sought out vulnerable women, drew them under his control, and caused them serious harm. What Yunus offered women in that position was somewhere to stay. What they got, according to the case prosecutors built against him, was a man who took control of every part of their lives once they were inside the flat, and made sure that nobody outside it knew where they were. Henriette Sux was last seen alive in 2016. Shortly after she died, Yunus walked into a shop and bought a chest freezer for £169.99, paying in cash. Prosecutors told the jury the freezer had been purchased for one reason only, which was to hide her body. Mustafa was added to it around 2 years later. Both women had suffered serious violence before they died, and the medical evidence presented at trial made that unambiguous. For 3 years, nothing happened. There was no search warrant and no forensic team, and the freezer sat in a flat that officers had reason to visit more than once. When police finally opened it in April 2019, only one body was visible. The second was found only because the entire freezer was removed from the flat and passed through an X-ray scanner. Yunus was arrested 3 days after the discovery. He told officers that it was his house and his problem, and that nobody else was involved. And to everything else, he answered no comment. How do 2 women, both known to the system as vulnerable, disappear for years without either case ever becoming urgent? At Southwark Crown Court, Eunice pleaded guilty to 2 counts of preventing a lawful and decent burial. He denied murdering either woman. The jury deliberated for 16 hours and 6 minutes before convicting him of both murders in September 2020. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 38 years and told him he may never be released at all. The story did not end in the courtroom. A subsequent BBC Newsnight investigation examined how 2 vulnerable women could go missing in the same borough, from the same circles, without the connection being made. It documented failings in the police response and identified chances to find the killer that were missed while both women were still officially unaccounted for. Neither family was told anything meaningful for years. As of 2026, Zahid Yunus is serving his life sentence in the British prison system. With a minimum term of 38 years running from 2020, he will be in his 70s before he is even eligible to apply for release. And the sentencing judge made clear that eligibility and release are not the same thing. Both women had families who had spent years waiting for news, and both had been known to the authorities as being at risk long before either of them disappeared. Yunus kept both women in one place, behind a padlock, in the flat where he slept, for as long as he could get away with it. On the Dorset coast, 170 kilometers to the southwest, another man dealt with the same problem in the least subtle way imaginable. He took a body apart and spread it across an entire seaside town, and the first piece of it was found by a stranger sheltering from the rain. Benjamin Atkins. On a wet afternoon in late August 2023, a man walking a coastal footpath in Bournemouth stepped under a tree to get out of the rain and noticed a package that had been left there. What was inside it started one of the strangest recovery operations British police had run in years. Over the following weeks, officers searched gardens, gullies, and public parks across a quiet seaside suburb, gathering the remains of a man in pieces. The final piece would not be found for another 6 months, and only because the man who put it there decided to tell his own lawyers where to look. Simon Shotton was 49 years old, and he did not have a home of his own. He slept in a tent in the garden of a flat in Boscombe, on the eastern edge of Bournemouth, an arrangement he paid for by supplying the couple who lived there with crack cocaine and heroin rather than rent. He was, in effect, living in a stranger's back garden as part of a drug debt that ran in both directions. He was also the kind of man whose absence took a long time for anyone to formally register. The couple in the flat were Benjamin Lee Atkins, 49, a father of 2 from Bournemouth, and his partner Debbie Ann Pereira, who was 39. Atkins had a temper and a long relationship with the same drugs he was buying from the man in his garden. The arrangement in that flat was unstable in every direction, and on or around August 18, 2023, it ended. There was a dispute over money and drugs. Atkins killed Shotton in the flat. His account, which he stuck to through trial, was that Shotton had threatened him with a knife and that he had acted in self-defense, striking him with the end of a hairbrush and then a loudspeaker. What happened next is what the jury weighed most heavily. Atkins stole a hacksaw, dismembered the body, and then spent the following weeks distributing the remains around Boscombe. The first discovery came on August 26, 2023, on the Manor Steps Zigzag, a switchback footpath that runs down the cliff to the seafront. In early September, officers found further remains in the garden of the flat itself and a torso inside a suitcase at Boscombe Chine Gardens, a public park a short walk from the beach. Skull fragments were recovered from Walpole Lane in February 2024, months after the arrests, and only after Atkins made a disclosure to his own legal team. Investigators also traced a phone belonging to Shotton to a Cash Creators store, where it had been sold. Both Atkins and Pereira were arrested at the flat on the evening of September 1, 2023. In the back of the police van, Atkins was recorded saying he would kill again. What does a man think is going to happen when he says that out loud in a police vehicle with the recording equipment running? The trial took place at Winchester Crown Court. Atkins had already admitted perverting the course of justice and preventing a lawful burial. So the question in front of the jury was whether the killing itself was murder or self-defense. On May 22, 2024, they convicted him of murder. Sentencing followed on July 26th, when Mrs. Justice Stacy imposed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years and described what he had done to Simon Schotten after the killing as gruesome and shockingly callous. Debbie Pereira was acquitted of murder. She was convicted of perverting the course of justice and sentenced to 4 years. The recovery operation had by then run for 6 months across a town of holiday flats and public gardens, and it was residents and dog walkers, not detectives, who found 2 of the 4 sites. Officers had knocked on doors, asking people to check their own gardens. The 19-year minimum did not survive the year. In October 2024, the Court of Appeal reviewed the sentence following a referral from the Attorney General under the unduly lenient sentence scheme and increased the minimum term Atkins must serve before he can be considered for parole. As of 2026, Benjamin Atkins is serving that life sentence in the British prison system. And the earliest point at which a parole board can even look at his case now sits further away than the trial judge originally set it. Simon Schotten, a man who had been sleeping in a tent in someone else's garden, was recovered from 4 separate locations across the town where he died. Atkins scattered a body across a seaside town in a matter of weeks and was in custody within a fortnight. Half a century earlier, in a port city on the other side of the North Sea, another man hid 4 women inside the walls of the flat he lived in, and nobody came looking for any of them, because the women he chose were ones the city had already stopped counting. Fritz Honka. On the morning of July 15, 1975, firefighters in Hamburg put out a blaze in a residential building and went through it floor by floor, checking for damage. In the attic flat, they found human remains that had been concealed behind a partition wall, and the more they looked, the more there was. The man who rented the flat was not home. He was working a night shift as a watchman, and he had been living alongside what was hidden in those walls for close to 5 years. The 4 women were Gertrude Breuer, Anna Buschel, Frieda Roblick, and Ruth Schult. They ranged from their early 40s to their late 50s, and each of them had ended up drinking in the bars around the Reeperbahn, Hamburg's red light district, after their lives came apart in one way or another. Breuer had trained and worked as a hairdresser before alcohol and homelessness took that from her. What all 4 shared was that they were women the city had already stopped keeping track of, which is precisely why their disappearances raised so little noise. Friedrich Paul Honka, known as Fritz, was born in 1935 and had a childhood shaped by wartime Germany and poverty. He worked as a shipyard laborer and later as a night watchman, and he was a severe alcoholic long before any of this began. He was physically distinctive in a way that made him memorable in the bars he drank in, and he was known there. In 1975, separately from anything police then knew about, he was fined 4,500 German marks in a matter connected to a rape allegation. The bar he used most was on the Reeperbahn, and it was called Der Goldene Handschuh, the Golden Glove. It was the kind of place where the drinking started early, and nobody asked where anybody went at closing time. Honka met all 4 women there, or in bars like it, and took them back to his attic flat at Zeissstrasse 74. The first was Gertrude Breuer in December 1970. Each killing followed a similar pattern, beginning with heavy drinking and a dispute. and ending with Honka strangling the woman he had brought home. He then concealed the bodies in and around the flat, with 3 of them kept inside the property itself, behind walls and in recesses. He continued living there. He continued going to the same bar and bringing people home. Between December 1970 and the summer of 1975, 4 women vanished from the same small circuit of bars in the same district of the same city. There was no coordinated investigation, no task force, and no public warning. And the reason is uncomfortable but straightforward. Nobody with the authority to act treated the disappearance of an alcoholic, homeless, or sex-working woman in her 40s or 50s as an event that required explaining. When the fire brought firefighters into the building on that July morning, Honka was arrested within hours of the discovery. He initially gave partial admissions, conceding some of it and denying the rest, before providing a full confession by the end of July 1975. How many disappearances have to happen in the same handful of streets before anyone treats them as connected? The trial opened in 1976 at the Hamburg District Court, with Honka defended by Rolf Bossi, one of the best-known criminal defense lawyers in West Germany. The defense built its case around his alcoholism, arguing that his capacity to control his actions had been substantially diminished, and the court accepted a version of that argument. Honka was found guilty of 1 count of murder for the death of Anna Buchel and 3 counts of manslaughter for the other 3 women. The sentence was 15 years, and he was committed to a psychiatric hospital rather than a conventional prison. 4 women had died in his flat over 5 years, and the German legal system concluded that the man responsible was less than fully accountable for 3 of those deaths. He was released in 1993. He lived the remainder of his life quietly in Hamburg under the name Peter Jensen, and died in a Hamburg hospital on October 19, 1998, at the age of 63. As of 2026, Fritz Honka has been dead for more than 25 years, and the strangest part of his legacy is how much larger it has grown since. His name became a novelty song while he was still awaiting trial. Decades later, it became a best-selling German novel by Heinz Strunk, and then a 2019 feature film, both named after the bar where he found the women he killed. The 4 women themselves are remembered on a memorial in Hamburg, which for most of them is the closest thing to a public acknowledgement they ever received. Honka was caught by accident, by a fire he had nothing to do with, in a city that was not looking for him. 15 years later, and an ocean away, detectives in Dallas had the reverse of that problem. They knew somebody specific was killing women in their city. They could see the same signature on every scene, and for 3 months, they could not attach a name to it. Charles Albright. In December 1990, Dallas police found the body of a woman in an abandoned house in Oak Cliff, and the detail that stopped every detective in the room was not the gunshot. Her eyes had been removed, and removed with care, by somebody who understood exactly what they were doing with a blade. It happened again in February and again in March, and no eyes were ever recovered from any scene. Whoever was doing it was either surgically trained or had been practicing on something for a very long time. Mary Lou Pratt was 33 and was found on December 13, 1990. Susan Peterson, known as Beth, was 27 and was found on February 10, 1991. Shirley Williams, whose age is recorded between 41 and 45, depending on the source, was found in the middle of March that same year. All 3 worked as sex workers in the Oak Cliff area of South Dallas at the height of the crack epidemic, which meant they were living in the exact conditions that make a person easy to approach and slow to be missed. Charles Frederick Albright was born in 1933 and adopted as an infant. and he worked for a time as a science teacher. He had a background in taxidermy and a documented fixation on eyes, which in taxidermy are the one feature a preparator has to build rather than preserve. He also had a criminal record already, for burglary, forgery, and theft. He was 57 years old, married and living in Dallas when the killings began. The press gave him a name before police had one for him, and he became the eyeball killer while the investigation was still open. A fourth woman, Rhonda Bowie, had been attacked and stabbed in the same part of Dallas in 1988 and survived, and her case is sometimes attached to the series, although nothing was done to her eyes and no charge was ever brought over it. The 3 deaths were linked immediately by the signature. Everything else about the investigation was difficult. The victims worked at night in an area where witnesses did not volunteer information to police, and the physical evidence at each scene was limited. It was only after Shirley Williams was found in March 1991 that witnesses began coming forward with descriptions and eventually a name. Police searched Albright's home more than once. They found X-Acto blades, close-up photographs of women's eyes, and a collection of true crime material. What they never found was a weapon that could be tied to any of the 3 deaths. The prosecutor, Toby Shook, went to trial with a case built almost entirely on hair and fiber analysis. Hairs recovered from the victims were said to match Albright. Fibers on the bodies were matched to a blanket in his truck. Hairs found inside the bag of his vacuum cleaner were matched to Shirley Williams. There was one thing the searches did not produce, and never would. Not one of the 6 missing eyes was ever recovered, from his house, his vehicle, or anywhere else. And no explanation for that has ever been established in a courtroom. Albright was arrested at his home on March 22, 1991. Can 3 killings safely rest on a handful of hairs and a blanket? The trial began on December 13, 1991. It did not cover all 3 deaths. Prosecutors proceeded only on the murder of Shirley Williams, because that was the one where the forensic evidence was strongest, and the charges relating to Mary Lou Pratt and Susan Peterson were dropped for insufficient evidence. On December 18, 1991, the jury convicted Albright of the murder of Shirley Williams, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. At the time, it was treated as a landmark Texas conviction, one of the first won almost entirely on hair and fiber comparison rather than eyewitness testimony or a confession. Albright appealed. The 5th District Court of Appeals rejected that appeal in 1994, and the conviction stood. In the decades since, that same forensic method has come under sustained criticism. Microscopic hair comparison, which was once presented to juries as close to conclusive, has been the subject of national review in the United States. And a number of commentators have questioned whether the evidence that convicted Albright would meet today's standards. The conviction has never been overturned. As of 2026, Charles Albright is dead. He died on August 22, 2020, at the age of 87, while incarcerated at the John Montford Psychiatric Unit in Lubbock, Texas. The cause of death was never publicly confirmed. He was convicted of 1 murder and suspected of 3, which means that on paper, in the state of Texas, the killings of Mary Lou Pratt and Susan Peterson remain unsolved to this day. Albright was invisible to Dallas police for 3 months, hunting through a city that barely registered the women he was taking. The man in the case that follows was never invisible to anybody. He had already been flagged by police, monitored by his own housing association, and filmed by cameras installed in his building for the specific purpose of keeping watch on him. And he still killed 3 women before anyone stopped him. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Stephen Griffiths. In late May 2010, a caretaker at a block of flats in Bradford sat down to go through the building's security footage. Those cameras had been installed for one specific reason, which was to keep an eye on the tenant in one of the upper flats. What the caretaker watched on that screen was that tenant attacking a woman in the corridor outside his door. And then, once it was over, lifting a drink towards the lens as though he wanted whoever eventually reviewed the tape to know he had seen it too. He had been on the radar of police, probation services, and his own housing association for most of his adult life, and none of it had stopped him. Susan Rushworth was 43 and disappeared on June 22, 2009, and her body has never been recovered. Shelley Armitage was 31 and was last seen on April 26, 2010. Suzanne Blamiers was 36 and died on May 21, 2010. All three worked as sex workers in the small red light district around Bradford City Center, within walking distance of the flat where they died. And all three were women whose absences were noticed by their families long before they were treated as urgent by anybody else. Stephen Sean Griffiths was born on Christmas Eve, 1969, and by 2009 he was a mature postgraduate student at the University of Bradford, working on a doctorate in criminology. His subject was Victorian murder in the north of England. His own file was already substantial. At 17, he had received a 3-year sentence for an unprovoked knife attack on a shop supervisor. In 1991, he was assessed by psychiatrists and described as a schizoid psychopath. He later served 2 years for holding a knife to a girl's throat. West Yorkshire police had monitored him and had at one point seized hunting weapons from his home, and his housing association had upgraded the closed-circuit cameras in his building after staff saw him reading books about dismemberment. He used a crossbow. That single detail is what made the case unusual from the first day, because a crossbow is a weapon nobody expects in a British city in the 21st century, and it is silent. He dismembered the 3 women after their deaths, and later told police that he had consumed parts of them, a claim he repeated in court. The remains of Suzanne Blamiers were recovered from the River Aire at Shipley over a period of days by search teams working in the water. There is a detail in the timeline that people tend to skip past. Susan Rushworth disappeared in June 2009, and Shelley Armitage was not taken until the following April. For 10 months, Griffiths went to seminars, submitted written work on Victorian murder in northern English cities, and lived quietly in the same flat. And nothing at all happened. The footage that ended it was recorded on May 21, 2010. It showed Suzanne Blamiers escaping from the flat into the corridor, and Griffiths following her out, shooting her with the crossbow and pulling her back inside. 3 days later, the caretaker reviewed the recordings and called the police. Officers who searched the flat found evidence that Griffiths made no serious attempt to hide. And when he was taken into custody, he told them he had killed a great many more people than the 3 they knew about. He never produced a name, a date, or location for any of them. When he first appeared before magistrates in Bradford, he was asked to confirm his identity, and instead of giving his name, he described himself as the crossbow cannibal. How many separate agencies have to be watching one man before somebody acts on what they are seeing? He pleaded guilty at Leeds Crown Court, and the conviction was entered on December 21, 2010. Mr. Justice Openshaw described the 3 murders as so wicked and monstrous that the man responsible should be kept in prison for the rest of his life, and imposed a whole life order. In England and Wales, that is the most severe sentence available. It carries no minimum term, no parole eligibility, and no release date, and there are fewer than 100 prisoners currently subject to one. As of 2026, Stephen Griffiths is alive and held within the high security estate, having spent time at HMP Wakefield, among other prisons. Reports have appeared in the British press over the years, describing assaults on him by other inmates. Those accounts come from tabloid sources and have not been confirmed by the prison service, and they are worth treating with caution. What is not in dispute is that Susan Rushworth has never been found, which means that of the 3 families involved, one still has nothing to bury. Griffiths killed inside a building where he knew he was being watched, and that arrogance is what finished him. Nearly 8,000 kilometers away in northeastern Brazil, 3 people were doing something far stranger in a town where nobody was watching them at all, and they had been doing it for 4 years before a single police officer had any reason to look in their direction. Jorge Beltrão Negromonte da Silveira. In April 2012, officers in the Brazilian state of Pernambuco were following up on something small. A woman had gone missing, and her bank card had been used afterwards at a handful of shops. Tracing those purchases led them to a modest house in the town of Garanhuns, where 3 adults lived together with several children, and to a backyard that would occupy investigators for weeks. What ended the case was not forensic science or surveillance. It was a stolen card, and a small child in that house who answered an officer's questions honestly. Jessica Camila da Silva Pereira was still a teenager, homeless, and raising a baby daughter when she was offered a job as a nanny in Olinda in May 2008. Gisele Helena da Silva was 31, and her life was taken in February 2012. Alexandra da Silva Falcão was 20, and hers was taken the following month. Every one of them was approached the same way, with the offer of paid work or a safe place to stay, which is an offer that only works on people who have neither. The man at the center of it was Jorge Beltrão Negromonte da Silveira, born on December 14, 1961. He described himself as the leader of a small sect he called the Cartel, and he had written a manuscript setting out his beliefs, which he titled as Revelations of a Schizophrenic, and in which he wrote about hearing voices. He lived with his wife, Isabel Cristina Torreo Pires, and his mistress, Bruna Cristina Oliveira da Silva. The 3 of them shared a household and, according to the case built against them, shared everything else about what went on inside it. The doctrine Negromonte had assembled held that the population of the earth needed to be reduced, and that certain people had to be purified. Prosecutors established that the group consumed the remains of the women whose lives they took, and that food prepared in that house had been sold to people in the town. That is the detail that put the case on front pages around the world, and it is the last time this video will mention it, because it is also the detail that has almost entirely erased 3 women and a young mother from the story that gets told about them. After Jessica Camila's passing, her daughter was not abandoned. She was taken into the household and raised there alongside the group's own children in the same house by the same people for 4 years. What made the group difficult to see was that it did not look like a group. It looked like a family. 3 adults, several children, a house in a residential street, and a small food business in a town of around 130,000 people, where that description fits hundreds of households. The arrest warrants were issued on April 9, 2012, and the property was raided 2 days later. Officers searching the backyard uncovered human remains that had been buried there, along with items connected to the group's beliefs. Much of what directed them to the right ground came from Jessica's daughter, who told an officer in the plain way that children describe the world they know. Things about that house that no adult would have volunteered. How does a household do this for 4 years in a town small enough that everybody buys from the same handful of shops? The 3 of them were tried twice. In 2014, all 3 were convicted over the death of Jessica Camila da Silva Pereira, with Negromonte receiving around 23 years and Pires and Oliveira around 19 years each. In 2018, they were tried again for the deaths of Gisele Helena da Silva and Alexandra da Silva Falcão, and the sentences handed down were far heavier. Negromonte received 71 years, Pires received 68, and Oliveira received 71 years and 10 months. Their combined totals landed somewhere between 92 and 95 years each. Those numbers require one piece of context. Brazilian law places a ceiling on how long any person can actually be held, regardless of how large the total on the sentencing sheet becomes, so figures like these function as a statement of how the courts viewed the case, rather than as a literal schedule. All three appealed. None of those appeals disturbed the convictions. As of 2026, Jorge Beltrão Negromonte da Silveira, Isabel Cristina Torreão Pires, and Bruna Cristina Oliveira da Silva remain in Brazilian custody. The child who told police what she knew was placed with relatives, and her identity has been protected by the Brazilian courts ever since, which is the one part of this case that worked exactly as it should have. Negromonte's group found the women they were looking for by offering work to people who badly needed it. 14 years earlier, in South Africa, a man had built his entire method on that same lie, except he had constructed a whole organization around it, complete with a name, a letterhead, and a stated mission to protect vulnerable people from harm. Moses Sithole. In 1995, a journalist at a Johannesburg newspaper picked up her phone and found herself talking to a man who said he was the person the entire country was looking for. He gave her a false name. Then he began describing a series of deaths across 3 separate towns in Gauteng in a level of detail that nobody outside the investigation could have had, and explaining at length why he believed he had been justified. The journalist was Tamsin de Beer, and the name he gave her was Joseph Maguena. She kept him talking. That phone call, and the testimony she later gave about it in court, became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the largest series of murder charges ever brought in a South African courtroom. The confirmed victims number 38. 37 of them were women, most of them young and unemployed, looking for work in the townships around Johannesburg and Pretoria in the first 18 months after the end of apartheid. The 38th was a small boy named Sibusiso Ndlangamandla, who was with his mother, Letta Nomthandazo Ndlangamandla, when she was taken, and who was left at the scene and did not survive. A number of the women were never identified at all, and appear in the court record by description rather than by name. Moses Sithole was born on November 17, 1964, in Vosloorus, on the East Rand. He had a conviction from 1989 for rape, for which he served 6 years, and he was released in 1993. Within a year of his release, he had founded an organization called Youth Against Human Abuse, which presented itself as a charity working to protect people from violence. It had no funding, no staff, and no program. What it had was a name that sounded legitimate enough to open a conversation with a stranger. The deaths became known as the ABC murders, not because of any pattern in the victims, but because of where they happened. Atteridgeville, Boksburg, and Cleveland, 3 places within reach of one another around the industrial spine of Gauteng. Sithole approached women who were looking for employment, told them his organization had work available, and asked them to come and see the site or the office. He took them instead to open ground, away from any road, and their lives ended there. The manhunt that followed was the largest South Africa had ever mounted, and it was happening in a country that had held its first democratic election barely a year earlier, and was rebuilding its police service from the ground up at the same time. Investigators initially considered the possibility that more than one offender was responsible, because the number of deaths across the three areas seemed too high for a single person operating alone in that time frame. For more than a year, the investigation had almost nothing. The victims came from communities with limited contact with the police, in a country that was in the middle of rebuilding its entire state apparatus, and a significant number of the women were not reported missing at all in the first instance. They were found in scrub, in fields and on disused ground, sometimes weeks apart, and the connection between them was made largely by the repetition of the method rather than by any physical evidence left behind. Why would a man who had gone unidentified for over a year pick up a telephone and call a newspaper? Whatever the reason, it closed the gap. Sithole was cornered by police in Johannesburg on November 6, 1995. He attacked an officer with a hatchet during the confrontation and was shot, and he survived his injuries. On examination in custody, he was found to be HIV positive and to have tuberculosis. He pleaded not guilty to everything. The trial ran for months. On December 5, 1997, Moses Sithole was convicted of 38 counts of murder, 40 counts of rape, and 6 counts of robbery. The sentence the court handed down has no real equivalent anywhere else. 50 years for each of the 38 deaths, plus the terms attached to the other counts, producing a total effective sentence of 2,410 years, with a requirement that he serve at least 930 years before he could be considered for parole. The judge stated openly that he would have imposed the death penalty had the Constitutional Court not ruled it unlawful 2 years earlier. As of 2026, Moses Sithole is alive and held at the Mangung Correctional Center outside Bloemfontein, having previously been kept in the maximum security unit at Pretoria Central. He challenged that transfer in 2012, and the challenge was dismissed. He will not leave custody. Sithole announced himself, and the call he made is a large part of the reason he was identified at all. In that same corner of South Africa, barely a year later, another man was doing the reverse, and doing it so effectively that the detectives working the case spent 2 years convinced they were chasing 2 entirely different people. Cedric Maki. Through 1996 and 1997, police in Johannesburg believed they were hunting 2 separate serial killers at the same time. One of them was attacking couples out at a lakeside recreation area on the south side of the city, a place called Wemmer Pan. The other was walking into small tailoring shops in the inner city and attacking the elderly men who ran them. 2 sets of detectives, 2 sets of files, 2 nicknames for 2 men who did not exist, because it was one person the entire time. And the thing that finally proved it was a paper slip from a shop counter. The people who died at Wemmer Pan were couples, some of them walking around the water in the evening, and some of them sitting in parked cars. The men were attacked with rocks or shot, and the women who were with them were assaulted. The second group of victims were almost all elderly small business owners in the inner city. A large proportion of them Indian tailors and shopkeepers who worked alone in narrow premises, attacked with hammers during robberies. 27 people died in total, and dozens more survived attacks that were intended to end their lives. Mathopa Cedric Maki was born in 1965 and worked as a self-employed plumber. He had left school in Standard 8 after his father died, and he moved between 2 lives, keeping a wife and 4 children in Limpopo province and a girlfriend in Johannesburg. He was not a drifter, and he was not unemployed. He had a trade, a van, and a reason to be in almost any part of the city at almost any hour, which is a substantial advantage for somebody who does not want to be conspicuous. There is a second number in this case that gets less attention than the 27. 26 people survived attacks that were intended to end their lives, and a number of them were able to describe the man who attacked them. Those survivors would become central to the prosecution because they could do what no forensic report could, which was put a face in a courtroom. The two nicknames tell you how effective the split was. The Wemmer Pan killer and the Hammer murderer had different weapons, different victims, different hours, in different parts of the city, and there was no reason for anybody to put them together. Everything a profiler would normally use to link a series pointed away from a single offender. Make was arrested on December 23, 1997. The connection between the two investigations was established the following month, in January 1998, by Superintendent Piet Bijleveld, who would become the best-known detective in the country, largely on the strength of this case. What he found was a lay-by slip carrying the name Patrick Mokwena, an alias Make had used twice, once to sell a bicycle taken from a victim at Wemmer Pan, and once to leave a shirt at a tailor's shop where the owner was later attacked and killed. One false name, written down twice, in two files that nobody had thought to put side by side. Bijleveld would later say that the breakthrough came from reading old paperwork rather than from any technique, and that the slip had been sitting in an evidence file for months before anybody looked at it against the other case. The investigation also became one of the earliest South African cases to use geographic profiling and mapping software to plot offense locations, an approach that was still novel at the time and is now standard. How did two murder investigations run in parallel in the same city for 2 years without anybody connecting them? The trial that followed was enormous. Make faced 133 charges in total, and in September 2000, he was convicted of 27 murders, 26 attempted murders, 14 rapes, and 41 aggravated robberies. Judge Geraldine Borchers said in sentencing that he had to be permanently removed from society, describing him as a dangerous man who would kill without hesitation or remorse. She imposed 27 life sentences, plus additional terms, which together totaled 1,340 years. 27 life terms means one for every person who died, which is a deliberate choice courts make so that no victim is quietly folded into a total. As of 2026, Cedric Make is alive and in South African custody, although the specific facility has not been reliably confirmed in recent reporting. By 2023, he had passed the point at which South African law technically allows a lifer sentenced under the older framework to be considered for parole, having served roughly 25 years. Specialists who commented at the time regarded any actual release as extremely unlikely, and no release has been recorded. His file remains one of the largest ever compiled by the South African Police Service. Make was hunted intensively by 2 teams of detectives who simply could not see that they were chasing the same man. In North Sumatra, over a period more than 5 times as long, there was no hunt at all, because the women who went to see the man in the sugarcane fields had told nobody they were going. Ahmad Suraji. For 11 years, women in a district of North Sumatra traveled out to see a man who was known across the region as a healer. They went to him about love, about money, about their appearance and their luck. And a great many of them told nobody where they were going because admitting that you had consulted a sorcerer was something you kept to yourself. Dozens of them did not come home. And because so many had left without telling anyone, there was no pattern for anybody to notice, no cluster of reports landing on the same desk, and no reason for the name of a respected cattle breeder on the edge of Medan to ever come up. The victims were women and girls from villages in and around Delhi Serdang, on the outskirts of the city of Medan. They came from ordinary families and ordinary circumstances. And what they had in common was that they had a problem they believed could not be solved by ordinary means. 42 of them were eventually accounted for. The clothing and personal effects of around 25 were found on the property before anyone could put a name to who they had belonged to. Ahmad Suraji was born on January 10, 1949. He kept cattle, and he worked as a dukun, which is the Indonesian term for a traditional healer and spiritual practitioner, a role that carries genuine standing in rural communities. He lived on the outskirts of Medan with 3 wives who were sisters. Within his village, he was respected, consulted, and entirely unremarkable, which is precisely why he was able to do what he did for as long as he did. By his own account, given after his arrest, it began with a dream in 1986 in which his dead father instructed him to take the lives of 70 women and to drink their saliva, and told him that doing so would give him supernatural power. He acted on that instruction for the next 11 years. The women who came to him were taken out to a sugarcane plantation behind his home, and their lives ended there. He buried them in the plantation ground in a deliberate arrangement, positioned in relation to his house. It matters that he was a dukun and not a stranger. A dukun is consulted the way somebody elsewhere might consult a lawyer or a doctor, and the visit is private by convention. Families did not always know where their daughters and sisters had gone, and when those women did not return, there was frequently nobody who could tell the police where to start. Several of the disappearances were never reported at all. The end came in the last days of April 1997, when human remains were found in the sugarcane field. Once officers searched the property itself and recovered the belongings of dozens of missing women, the scale of it became clear very quickly. Suraji confessed to 42. His 3 wives were arrested as well, accused of assisting him and of helping to conceal what had happened. How does a man do this for 11 years without a single missing persons inquiry ever reaching his door? He had told police that the instruction in the dream was for 70. He stopped, or was stopped, at 42. His trial opened on December 11, 1997, with a charge sheet running to 363 pages. Having confessed after his arrest, Suraji then maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, and his wives told the court that their own statements had been obtained under duress. On April 27, 1998, a panel of 3 judges at the Lubuk Pakam District Court convicted him and sentenced him to death by firing squad. And the public gallery cheered when the sentence was read. His wife Tumani was also sentenced to death for her part in it, and that sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Indonesia carries out capital punishment by firing squad, and the process is conducted at night, away from any public setting, with the condemned taken from the prison to a designated location. Suraji's case moved slowly, even by the standards of that system. The sentence then sat unexecuted for a decade, while the case moved through appeals and clemency processes. On the night of July 10, 2008, Ahmad Suraji was taken to a plantation in Deli Serdang and executed by a mobile brigade firing squad a little over 11 years after his arrest. Amnesty International had made a final appeal for the sentence to be commuted, which was refused. His last request, to see his wife before it was carried out, was granted. 42 is the number he confessed to, and the number the court worked from. Whether it is the true total is a question the Indonesian state closed permanently when the sentence was carried out. As of 2026, Ahmad Suraji has been dead for 18 years, and Tumini remains in Indonesian custody serving her life sentence. Of the 42 women and girls accounted for in the case, a number were never formally identified, and the sugarcane field where they were found was returned to cultivation. That's all 10 cases. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.